Welcome into the Picker's Corner. I'm your host, Scott, from Picker's Paradise here in Nashua. Today, unfortunately, we're not going to talk about the Nashua artifact that I had mentioned at the end of last show. I was unable to go and retrieve it from my picker friend out in Haverhill. He had a little bit of an emergency, and I haven't been able to get out to him since. So instead, we're going to talk about McCoy pottery. Now, McCoy pottery, the story of the McCoys and their pottery companies are going to sound very familiar with the Underhill story that we talked about, as well as the Homer Laughlin story that we talked about before. So we're actually going to start talking about with McCoy, not the McCoy company that most people know when you hear McCoy mentioned today. So we're going to go all the way back to 1848, and in that time frame, it was the first recording of the McCoy family starting their own pottery, and that was in 1848. It was a little small factory in the Ohio River area, much like when we talked about the Laughlins. And so they started in 1848, and then in 1876, the son of W.N. McCoy, who started in 1848, J.W. McCoy, he partners with his father-in-law and creates a mercantile business called Brown and McCoy in Roseville, Ohio, and they made limited amounts of pottery. Now let me take a step back. It was never really documented too well on if J.W. worked with W.N. at his original little pottery, business, but it is assumed so because he had an interest, and that's what his foray was in 1876 when he took on that business partnership with Mr. Brown, his father-in-law. But there's not a whole lot of history annotated between 1848 and 1876 that I could find about the history of J.W. So fast forward another 10 years, J.W. McCoy, he opens a pottery company with a partner with the last name of Williams. It's called the Williams and McCoy Pottery Company. A couple years later, 1888, J.W., actually Brown and McCoy, that was started with his father-in-law, is sold, and Mr. Brown goes into furniture. J.W. continues making pottery. In 1890, the William and McCoy Pottery Company merged and renamed Kildrow, Williams, and McCoy Pottery Company. So I want you to also realize that each time there's a merger or a purchase and acquisition in the pottery world, especially back then, a lot of the positives that came out of those was, or a lot of the reason why they happened was one company was interested not in the customer base so much of the company that they were merging or acquiring. It was more in the patterns, the infrastructure, the business, the kilns. It was to increase production and also create a larger offering of products at the same time. So then in 1892, that company, the Kildrow, Williams, and McCoy, is renamed the Midland Pottery Company. In 1898, that company is sold to Roseville Pottery Company, which a lot of people know. It's another very popular art pottery from that time period. And so a year later, J.W. McCoy founds the J.W. McCoy Pottery Company in Roseville, Ohio. So this J.W. McCoy Pottery Company is some of what will become the McCoy pottery that most of us know through the 1900s, through the 20th century. In 1902, J.W. starts making art pottery pieces. Now, originally, most of the pottery that was done in Roseville, in that area, the Ohio River Valley, a lot of it was utilitarian pottery. It was things that were made for food storage and for shipping, and also for being used with other products. They'd mold things to be used like stoppers and bottles and that type of thing as well. So a lot of utilitarian use, not so much for art and decoration and things of that nature. So in 1910, J.W. McCoy assists his son Nelson in establishing the Nelson McCoy Sanitary and Stoneware Company in Roseville, Ohio. Now this is the company that will end up becoming the McCoy that we all know for the most part. When I started doing this, I didn't realize that there were so many different McCoys in the family that were doing pottery, and that there was a number of companies that actually produced pottery under the name McCoy, and that it wasn't just one singular company. So that company that was started in 1910, they pretty much produced utilitarian stoneware. They bought and sold and mined clay. As we know, the Ohio River area where Roseville is, and we also talked about a little bit, I think it's further north, where the Homer Laughlin Company started, all along the Ohio River. Great deposits of clay there. That's why all these pottery places were started there. So they also, very similarly to the Homer Laughlin Company, Roseville actually donated the land that their first facility was built on free of cost. Again, at the time, early 1900s, towns are basically giving land to people to start companies to try to bring the towns into prominence, basically. If they can start a company that grows, it brings in people, which bring in, other stores, other business and industry. So it's kind of a, in the early 1900s, as we've seen now in a couple instances, was really a time where it was the interest of the towns to actually really try to support business. And plus, I'm sure they probably had the land to afford to be able to give away at that time. I don't think that's so much the case in a lot of places today, but it really shows that a lot of the entrepreneurs that started these companies most likely started with very little and were able to create something that lasted hundreds of years, or at least 100 years. So that's pretty impressive. And wouldn't have been able to do it without somebody else helping them. So in 1911, the J.W. McCoy Pottery Company, which is not what we just talked about, the Nelson McCoy. So they're acquired by George Brush, and it becomes the Brush McCoy Pottery Company. Now, Brush McCoy is one of the more popular pottery makers. You will see their stuff in antique shops and thrift stores and the like. And I never knew that the Nelson McCoy and Brush McCoy were two different entities. I thought it was just in different timelines, but no, it's actually both companies were manufacturing pottery at the same time. One with J.W. and Nelson, which was actually just Nelson's business, and then another one with J.W. And George Brush. So in 1918, the McCoy family sells their interest in the Brush McCoy Company, but George Brush keeps using the McCoy name, the Brush McCoy name, until 1925, which is kind of interesting. And actually, I didn't realize this, and then after they dropped the McCoy name, it was just Brush Pottery. I had no idea that the Brush Pottery Company actually existed and created pottery into 1982. So they had quite a long run from the 19-teens to 1982. In 1919, the Nelson McCoy Sanitary and Stoneware Company, they partnered with 11 other stoneware companies to form the American Clay Products Company, or ACPC, as it ends up being called. And you'll see that marking on pieces of pottery sometimes. And basically what the ACPC was an organization that didn't make any pottery. It was basically just a means to promote, catalog, and have salespeople go out and sell pottery on behalf of the Nelson McCoy and 11 other companies. They were all in the Ohio River Valley area. I don't remember all of them, but there were some very popular ones that existed for tens and 20s of years later and are collectible pottery pieces today. But the ACPC didn't last long. It only lasted 7 years, and in 1926 it was liquidated. So by this time, as we talked about, the McCoy family getting out of Brush McCoy in 1925. The name isn't being used anymore. So in 1926, the McCoy family doesn't have any business interests or other than the Nelson McCoy Sanitary and Stoneware Company. So it's their singular focus, and they actually focus on expanding that company. So I'm guessing at this point, maybe if JW is still around, I doubt that. It's 100 years after he would have been around, but so he probably is still around. Not as WN I was thinking of. So JW is probably helping Nelson at this point, and it's a team, family effort. They upgrade equipment and install 300 foot long tunnel kilns in their manufacturing facility at that point, which it doesn't really go into detail. I couldn't find out if it was one of the continuous firing kilns like we talked about when we talked about the Homer Laughlin. And at 300 feet long, that would have been a long conveyor belt. I don't know if it was just a tunnel that basically had closed ends that you just filled and then fired for a 24-hour period, usually between bringing the temp up, holding it, and then bringing it back down without the pieces cracking. But we don't know. But we do know in 1929 that the Nelson McCoy Sanitary and Stoneware Company drops the "and" from the name and just becomes the Nelson McCoy Sanitary Stoneware Company. It said that they dropped the "and" to limit confusion as to what they did. I guess, it sounded like maybe they were a sanitary company and a stoneware company. I'm not quite sure. The sanitary portion of the name actually refers to, like I said, the utilitarian aspects of how they were using pottery pieces back, 19 teens, 1920s. And so, they wanted to put in the name that, the stuff that they made could be used commercially for food products or for other products, that it was a sanitary way. And then also, in that time, the washability and things like that of the pottery was also important. There was a lot of bed pans were made out of porcelain or clay at the time. So there was a lot of different products that were used in hospital facilities or in food service and food shipping, food manufacturing. That was all stoneware back then, which would be probably stainless steel or some other material today. So in 1933, the company changes their name again. They change it to the Nelson McCoy Pottery Company. Now, this change was required basically, if you think about the time frame now, you are mid-depression in 1933 basically. So there was a decrease in demand for food and sanitary ware. Of course, it's the Depression. People aren't going out to eat. Restaurants are closing. Hotels are closing. Those type of things are happening. So their demand for the sanitary products or sanitary pottery products is dropping. So they actually started seeing an increased demand in decorative pieces or art pottery. So they changed the name to say that, hey, we're just a pottery company. We do a little bit of everything. We do commercial pieces. We also do pieces for, everybody in their home. Now, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, they started implementing these 50-foot diameter kilns. And there's actually some pictures of them online. It's pretty interesting. You can't really see how big the 50 feet is because the pictures are basically focused on these piles of pottery all stacked in these kilns. But the 50-foot diameter kilns were able to hold about 5,000 pieces, depending on the size, of course. And so they were able to make 5,000 pieces every 24 hours in each of these, 50-foot diameter stacking kilns. So World War II, during that period, we're in the 1940s here. During World War II, Nelson McCoy was actually contracted to make clay landmine housings for the U.S. and the Allied forces. Now, this is important, well, not only because, it helped our country in World War II and the Allies in World War II. But it also kept the pottery company going during World War II, because the clay was actually something that was a restricted item at the time. And so having a contract with the government to make the landmine housings also allowed them to use anything that was excess from their landmine orders on pottery pieces that they could sell themselves. So they were able to keep a little bit of their, sanitary ware and art pottery wares being built at that time, along with side by side with the landmine parts. So in 1945, Nelson McCoy Sr., because he had a kid somewhere in between, he retires as president of the Nelson McCoy Pottery Company, the company that he started some, 30 years ago, 35 years ago. So in 1950, Nelson McCoy, or I'm going to say just the 1950s in general. So after World War II, as we talked about with the Homer Laughlin Company, there was a large spike in consumerism. The baby boomer generation started, all that kind of stuff. People were buying, expanding with funds that were basically profited from World War II. And the mid-century art pottery craze basically was taking over at this point as well. So the art pottery parts of the company were vastly outproducing what they were doing for sanitary ware by this point. And during the 1950s, the company also had to survive a major fire. They rebuilt the damage and actually expanded the plant during the 1950s after rebuilding it to over 200,000 square feet. And at that point during the 50s, the average output was about 50,000 pieces per day. So they were really cranking, and that's why you see so much of that McCoy mid-century art pottery around today. And during this time, their max output was in the tens of millions of pieces per year. If you think about it, 50,000 per day, 280, 300 working days a year. You get to around that like 10, 20, 30 million, range. And then they were also, as you could see, basically based on the market when you go out shopping today even, that they were one of the leading art pottery makers in the United States during that time frame, during the 1950s. So in 1954, Nelson McCoy Jr. becomes the president of the Nelson McCoy Pottery Company. Now, the Nelson McCoy Pottery Company in its entirety was actually had the same family, the family was the president for that company for basically most of its entirety through 4 generations, which is something that, again, you don't see a lot of today, but was definitely something that was important to the family. In 1967, as the decline of the art pottery starts happening, at least US made, because as we talked about the Homer Laughlin again, during the post-1950s into the 1960s, you started seeing a lot more cheaply made china coming from other parts of the world, and it started undercutting the pricing of the American pottery. So in 1967, the Nelson McCoy Pottery Company was sold to the Mount Clemens Pottery Company, and Nelson McCoy Jr. remained president of pottery. So basically, the Mount Clemens Pottery Company basically just bought McCoy and let McCoy just keep producing the way that they were. They didn't really interfere too much. They just basically owned whatever McCoy did. So in 1974, the company was sold again to the Lancaster Colony Corp. Again, not much changed. Ownership changed. McCoy kept doing their same thing. You still had Nelson McCoy in charge. And in 1981, finally Nelson McCoy retires as president of the Nelson McCoy Jr. retires as president of the company. And at this time, it's really starting to get to kind of the end of their run. And in 1985, the company actually was sold to Designer Accents, and merged with their company and was renamed Nelson McCoy Ceramics. And then a few years later, in 1989, designer Accents applies for the use of the trademark of the McCoy name on pottery. And I think from there, pretty much after they got that, 1990, Nelson McCoy Ceramics ceased operations. So the plant that was opened in 1910 goes for 80 years and is closed in 1990, ending McCoy's family run in the pottery business from 1846 to 1980. So quite a run through 4 generations of pottery. And now I'll start talking about some of this McCoy pottery I have in front of me. So as you can see, this is a bunch of different stuff, but it's all McCoy. So over the years, they did a lot of different things. So we'll start with what's the oldest piece here. And one thing I didn't mention when I was going through the timeline was that McCoy never marked their pottery. At least this is what I found in my research. It was mentioned a few places that they didn't start marking their pottery until the mid to late 1920s, once the McCoy name was actually with the McCoy family. Like I talked about in 1926-ish, when they were completely divested of all the other businesses except for Nelson McCoy. That's when they started marking their pottery. It also became a time frame when copyrights, patents, all that stuff was reaching a real height in the United States. So they were one to start marking their pottery. Name recognition. They were also out of the ACPC, so they wanted their pottery to stand alone as to what they've done. So this yellowish green picture here in front of me, this is actually the oldest piece that I have here. It is actually an unmarked piece. As you can see there on the bottom, it's got no markings whatsoever. And a lot of the unmarked pieces, the only way to figure out if they're real McCoys is to find their old catalogs. So, and that being said, catalogs from 1920 earlier, they do exist out there. You just got to find the right resources, the right libraries per se, where you can find them. But this pottery vase is in still pretty nice condition for probably being just over 100 years old now. So I'm going to move on. So this stoneware piece, this is one of the first markings that McCoy had used. So they didn't actually mark it with the McCoy name that you'll see with a lot of different pottery pieces that McCoy makes that you'll find everywhere else. So this M with the shield is just one of the different marks that they used in the early part of their markings through the 1930s and things like that. So this here is actually more that utilitarian type stoneware that we mentioned. This here would probably be like a pickling crock, or possibly anything for food storage or shipment, as well as possibly storage at manufacturing, things like that. So again, so this is probably about 80, 90 years old. Nice shape. And that 6 there represents the size. So this is 6 gallons, fits in this. This here is another piece, this bowl, kind of utilitarian. This is something that people would use at home, mixing bowl. And this little shield marking here is one of the ones, again, like that shield with the M over the top, is another one of their shielded marks that was used at the origin of their markings. And so this one, as you can see, is damaged quite a bit. It's got a crack that's repaired all the way around, things like that. But you know what? On a shelf, where you can't see the back, still looks pretty good. Gives you that nice old farm feel, the ribbed sides and everything. Moving on to something newer. This is a bean pot. And this bean pot has the McCoy markings on the bottom. And this piece, the LC there, so I didn't mention this and I didn't really do a whole lot of research on it, but they created a line. I can't remember the exact name of it, but so that's what this marking represents. As you can see, there's a pottery numbering on it. 341 is probably the mold or item number. It says McCoy across the middle. That's one of the main newer McCoy marks that you'll see out there. So this piece was probably made like 1970s, 1980s. Nice little brown drip with the white pottery. Now this one is probably one of the newer ones as well. This one, actually it's not one of the newer ones, sorry. The McCoy logo with the C going through the M. This is more of the late mid-century type marking. The style on this one is a little bit weird, and it might not show up too well out there on the video because this is green and we are working with a green screen. It's a light mint green over a pink, kind of rough, non-polished finish. It's definitely not something that McCoy is known for making, and it's a little cool, funky piece. I'm guessing this one might have been more towards like the 60s and stuff like that, or even like 70s. But yeah, so as you can see, over the years, McCoy did a lot of different things, and I also had some other planters and another planter that didn't quite work with the green screen. They also made tons of ashtrays and different things like that too, serving trays. Especially the mid-century stuff, if you can find the more different colors and patterns and things like that, they're worth some money. And then again, the older stuff, of course, the unmarked stuff, the utilitarian wear, is also very hard to find, but is also some big money when you do find them. So that is all for today, and I thank you so much for joining me again. Have a great time out picking, and I'll see you again next time.